The twin suns of Archaeprime blazed high above the dome of fury, where creatures from all across the sector screamed and howled in the stands made of fossil bone and warped steel, and the scent of blood both fresh and ancient soaked the sands that had seen 1,000 deaths and would drink 1,000 more, and at the heart of the chaos stood her the undefeated champion of the Bracken Empire, the one they called Sin of the Scorch. She towered over most beings, her forearms flexing in the air, her skin a slick armor of glimmering obsidian, her eyes like twin moons locked in an endless eclipse, and when they brought forth her challenger, the arena rippled with laughter, for what came out of the holding gates was not a beast or a monster, or even a brute, but a human, one of the soft ones, thin of limb, pale of skin, and with no armor save for a worn flight suit scorched at the edges, and marked with patches that meant nothing to the crowd. And when he stepped onto the killing ground, he neither trembled nor growled, he only looked at her with eyes that were strange, calm, full of silence. And then she laughed, not a chuckle, but a roar that cracked through the dome walls and made lesser creatures faint, for in her voice was the certainty of victory, the confidence of 100 kills, the hunger for a fresh and simple slaughter. And yet the human did not flinch. He raised his hand in greeting, and the crowd booed, throwing slag and bone at him as if to speed his death along. And Sin raised all 4 of her weapons to her serrated swords, forged from the fangs of void leviathans, and to her brutal axes taken from her dead brothers, and she lunged forward with a speed that would shame lightning. And yet the human moved not even a pace. He stood and waited, and only as the shadow of her strike fell over him did he breathe, and when he breathed the air itself bent. There had been a time before the arena, before the endless cycle of show and death, before the baits and the screams and the roar of blood, and it lived in the human's memory like an ember in a storm. His name once had weight, though here it meant nothing, a name spoken with respect in halls of science and war. Once known as Lieutenant Gerald Vane of the Terran remnant, once honored, now discarded, thrown to the gladiator pits as punishment, or sport or amusement, it did not matter. But what they had forgotten, what the Bracken and their laughing queen had not seen, was that Terrans were not built for show, they were built for war and suffering and survival. And Gerald had survived the fall of colonies, the death of crew, the loss of gravity itself. He had trained where sleep was rationed and pain was expected, and fire was a teacher. And when they captured him, when they stripped his rank and threw him into chains, they did not take his mind or his training. And in the weeks before this match he had studied, he had watched Sin tear through beasts twice her size. He had seen the flaw in her step, the slight pause when her lower left leg bore weight, the tension in her second right arm when it rotated past her midline, and as she came for him in the pit, her blades flashing with a joy only killers knew. He dropped to one knee, not in surrender, but in calculation, and her first swing passed over his head by a whisper. The second he caught not with strength, but with momentum, rolling under it and using her own force to twist her balance, and suddenly her left leg caught wrong and her knee buckled, and the crowd gasped, for she had never stumbled, not once, not ever. But Gerald was already moving his hands quick as spiders, his body a coil of purpose, and he struck with 2 fingers into the nerve cluster just below her thoracic seam, and she shrieked, not in rage, but in pain, a sound that had never come from her throat before. And Gerald stood, not smiling, not boasting, but silent, for silence was his blade, and every breath a weapon. The sun dipped low, and still they fought now, with the blood of both on the sand, and the silence in the crowd deep and cold as space itself, for they had never seen their queen falter, never seen her bleed. And yet here she was, reeling, her weapon slower now, her form imperfect, as Gerald pressed her again and again, his strikes small, efficient, merciless, each one aimed not to kill, but to dismantle her, one sense at a time, her balance, her speed, her rhythm. And Sin knew it, to knew that something had turned, that this was no accident, no lucky coward, this was strategy, this was skill, and it filled her with a terror she had not known, for in her victories she had never been hunted. And now she was prey, and Gerald never gave her space, never let her think. He moved like water, like smoke, like pain given flesh. And each time she roared and swung, he was already behind her, already striking, already gone. And the crowd began to turn, their jeers faded, their chants fell away, and some began to chant his name not because they loved him, but because he had shown them something they had forgotten, that the mind could slay the beast, that the weak could shatter the strong, that fear was not exclusive to prey and sin. Fell to one knee, her axes slipping from her hands, her swords trembling as she gasped, trying to understand how this could be. How this soft thing had broken her, and Gerald stood before her, eyes unreadable, his body bruised, but upright, and then he spoke not loud, but with a voice that carried through the dome, through the silence, through the history of blood and pride. He said, "You thought I was nothing, but you never saw what I survived." And then he turned from her, not to deliver a killing blow, but to let her live with what she had become. They did not cheer when he left the arena, they watched in silence, stunned and awed. As Gerald walked alone across the bone-white sand toward the gates that had brought him in, and as they opened and the shadows swallowed him, the sound of Sin's breathing was the only thing left in the dome. Ragged and slow and mortal, she sat there unchallenged, not dead, but undone. And in the days that followed, the story spread across systems how a human had walked into the arena of the undefeated, and had not just won, but dismantled her with precision and will and silence. And some said she never fought again, that she sat in the stands now watching others and never spoke, and others said she sought him, that she boarded a ship and vanished chasing something she could not name. And Gerald, he returned to the world not as a warrior or a killer, but as a whisper, a legend, not because he killed, but because he chose not to, because in a place built on death he showed a different power. And across the stars, where Terrans were mocked or feared or forgotten, his name began to rise, not with trumpets, but with a question, whispered in alien courts and criminal dens and war councils. What if the soft ones remember who they are? And across the galaxy one name remained, etched not in stone or metal, but in fear. Gerald Vane, the human who broke the unbreakable with nothing but his hands and his silence.